We're in a time right now of great uncertainty in Europe. The escalation of conflict is continuing. It is building up. The United States is supplying Bradley fighting vehicles, Patriot missiles. We now have Poland supplying Leopard tanks. The other tanks are about to come to the fray on the aid of Ukraine. Russia is somewhat less than totally pleased by this picture. And I've got news that Mr. Nikolai Patrushev, he is a close ally of Vladimir Putin, and he is he's the secretary, that is, of the Russian Security Council, and he is claiming that the West is already at war with Russia. He's coming, and he's often believed to be the replacement for Vladimir Putin. Well, I got a special guest tonight who has a lot of perspective on this, who's been trying to rally towards some peaceful resolution of all this. You've seen him on my channel before, and that is David Pyne. David Pyne is the he is the Deputy Director of Operations of the EMP Task Force, National Operations. Let me rephrase it. He is the Deputy Director of National Operations on the EMP Task Force of National and Homeland Security. Now, I'm a member of that group, but it's still a mouthful. I'm the Alabama State Director. So, Mr. Pyne also has served in the Army. He was an armor officer, and he was also an Army civil servant after that, serving in Army headquarters staff negotiation and dealing with weapon systems and exports for weapon systems to the Mideast, Eastern Europe, and also involved with what was in the Soviet Union. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. David Pyne. David, with all this escalation of stuff we're sending there and Russia's take on it, where do you see this heading?
You know, it's very disturbing to see all there's escalation going on both sides. The Biden administration continually crosses red lines it said it would never cross. As you mentioned, it's escalating arms shipments, Bradley fighting vehicles, and perhaps Stryker armored cars, as well as Patriot missile batteries. And Russia is understandably very concerned about that. In addition to that, there have been reports which have been confirmed that the U.S. is engaging in sabotage operations, either cyber and or kinetic, most likely both, against Russian military and industrial targets inside the Russian Federation itself. So that's a major escalation of the war. Eventually, if we continue this, we are certain to get blowback in terms of escalating Russian cyber attacks on targets in the U.S. homeland itself. But in response to that, breaking news today: Russian President Vladimir Putin has appointed the Russian military's chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov, to be the unified head of all Russian forces in Ukraine. So that indicates that Putin is putting his prestige on the line. This is no longer a special military operation or limited war from the Russian standpoint, as it has been during most of the past year. It is now an actual full-scale war, as you mentioned, that they view as being fought against NATO, and it truly is. It truly is. It's a limited war that Biden has been fighting, and NATO has been fighting against Russia, using Ukrainians as cannon fodder, essentially.
Some people don't agree with it, but the whole philosophy of this goes way back to when, way back in Russian history, to them trying to control the access points to Mother Russia, because most of Russia, including a lot of the land leading up to Ukraine, is just big, wide open, flat plains, which they deem to be all too easy to invade. So they've always tried to extend their empire into the areas of other adjacent peoples and dominate the key passes from which they could be invaded. That's been a long time strategy of theirs, and Putin pretty much admitted as much back in one of their celebrations back several months ago. And they also had stated it several times with regards to the alliance where Ukraine might be going, and they were greatly concerned that Ukraine was falling into the NATO sphere. And they to the Western side, from the Western viewpoint, that never made a lot of sense, but we don't see things the way the Russians do. And I'm not trying to justify it one way or the other. I'm just trying to explain that to them. This is a war with the West, and we have been slow to see that, and we may be proceeding with some peril here. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. I think certainly the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an illegal war of aggression. However, it is a provoked war. It is a war that NATO, the U.S., NATO, and specifically the U.S. itself has been provoking over the past 15 years now, starting with the Bucharest Declaration of 2008, in which NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO. And since then, the Biden administration, in particular, over the last year, 2 years actually, has repeated that over and over again. Most recently, well, most decisively with the strategic partnership agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine that was declared in November of 2021, which really got us into this mess in which Russia offered a mutual security agreement, which Biden then rejected, and that essentially provoked to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Putin had said essentially his minimum demand was that the U.S. and NATO provide a written guarantee that Ukraine would never become a NATO member, and that is something we could have given with absolutely no. There was really nothing to prevent us to do that. It would have cost nothing to U.S. national security. In fact, this entire war in Ukraine really has essentially nothing to do with the U.S. national interest. It is not an existential fight, even for Ukraine, and it does not threaten NATO security. In fact, the only thing that is threatening NATO security is the escalation of U.S. And NATO support for Ukraine and our escalating sabotage attacks against the Russian Federation itself. So that is kind of the biggest thing I'd like to clear up for your listeners, is that Russia does not, Putin does not have his sights set on all of Ukraine. This is essentially a border dispute. It's two things. It's a border dispute and it's a dispute about NATO. It could have been resolved in advance if President Biden had announced his support for the Minsk II agreement. That was the framework, the preferred framework that Putin had really been trying to pursue from 2015 to 2022, up until a couple days before the invasion. But most importantly, that the written guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO. But essentially, the ceasefire that Russia has proposed and that I've advocated Ukraine should accept would essentially, lock in Ukrainian battlefield gains. Russia would only want the Western Donbass region. It currently controls 60% of the province of Donetsk. So it would be wanting Western Donetsk, which is perhaps 1 or 2%, actually about 1% of Ukraine's total territory.
What could you reiterate again the agreement that the Biden administration made with Ukraine that you think precipitated this?
Yeah, so back on November 10th of 2021, the Biden administration signed an agreement with Ukraine, which was a strategic partnership agreement. So it was essentially, the way I view it is it formalized Ukraine's de facto NATO membership and said that it would become a formal member of NATO in the near future. And Putin viewed within, I guess, 3 weeks after that was signed, Russia began massing its troops on Ukraine's borders. So that was kind of the the red line essentially that Biden crossed that triggered this crisis, which again could have been avoidable if even if Obama had been president. This never would the war would have happened, but his policy was to not provide any military aid to Ukraine, knowing that that was a Russian red line and knowing that that would invariably lead to conflict with Russia. So even Obama was a much smarter president on foreign policy than Biden. And then, of course, if Trump had been president, the war would have never occurred in the first place. If Obama had been president, it would have occurred, but then it would have ended very quickly within several weeks by early April. with a negotiated peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. And actually, we came very close to that. They had a tentative peace agreement that was hammered out on March 31st in Istanbul. And then Russia withdrew in a pre-announced withdrawal. They withdrew from the 3 Ukrainian oblasts of the 8 that they occupied. And that kind of emboldened, Western leaders such, including, Boris Johnson, the previous Prime Minister of Britain, as well as President Biden, to reinforce Zelensky's desire to, drop all negotiations and fight to the bitter end with a blank check of Western military support, which up until that point, the Biden administration, the first few weeks of the war, he was absolutely encouraging peace negotiations to, prevent further losses in Ukraine.
Wow. So what about this? That when Russia and United States demanded that Ukraine give all their nukes to Russia, there was a peace agreement signed that said it was a non-aggression peace agreement, said neither side would attack Ukraine. And I believe it also obligated each side to come to the defense of Ukraine should Ukraine be attacked, or so I'm told. And I'm told by some that we have an obligation on that treaty to defend Ukraine. What do you make of that?
So that's actually a that it is incorrect. That's a misunderstood part of the agreement. So that you're referring to, of course, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994.
Right.
And with the Budapest Memorandum, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan all agreed to give up, or rather to return Soviet nuclear weapons to the Russian Federation. And in return, they received a security guarantee in a sense. Really, all it committed the U.S. to do was to bring a resolution condemning Russian military aggression against Ukraine in the UN General Assembly, and then also to consult with other members of the Security Council, other than Russia, of course, to decide how to respond. So really, it doesn't require us to defend Ukraine at all. And furthermore, I would add that even when it comes to the defense of NATO allies or treaty allies, which in most circumstances I would advocate we honor and defend against Russian or Chinese aggression, I think ultimately it shouldn't be a treaty, a piece of paper that decides what the U.S. should do when 250 million Americans, a quarter billion Americans' lives are at stake. I think it should be whatever the U.S. national interest is at the time, and certainly the British Empire ran that way. They said they had famously no permanent allies, only permanent interests. And so the U.S. should do what is in its its national security interest to protect, preserve, and defend the United States and its citizens, and put the U.S. ahead of any other country. But Ukraine, of course, is not an ally. It's not a treaty ally. So we have no obligations to defend it whatsoever.
Let's take that a step further. What real interest do we even have in Europe? What purpose does NATO today serve the United States in the wake of the breakup of the Soviet Union? I don't think Russia has a long time to run. I think they have some severe demographic issues, as does Europe. But it's kind of my opinion, if we pulled out and if Russia took all of Europe, Russia would fall apart eventually, and Europe would regain its independence, although at great loss. But when I was in the Army, I was highly disturbed that we spent so much of our time, money, and the blood of our young Americans, and I was, wasn't risk for that, to go over there and defend a land where they didn't put up the same level of effort in terms of money for their own defense, materials, and they used the advantage that we spent our money and tax money and national treasure on defending them, and they didn't, to build industries that competed with us. So they were competing with us with industries, and they had, some, generous governments to the people. At the same time, we were footing the bill to cover them, and I was somewhat less than absolutely ecstatic over that arrangement. I thought that, hey, they're not pulling their own. So I was really happy when Trump popped in and said, man, we ought to pull out of NATO, and he really got their attention. And they stepped up a little bit, but I don't really think they stepped up enough. And with what we're seeing here today, it really makes me wonder, David, what are we doing in NATO? Do we need to stay in NATO, or should we change the equation somewhat it seems to me that we are still carrying too much on our backs.
That's an outstanding question. President Trump's answer to that question was that no, it was time for the U.S. to leave NATO, and he told his advisors that a few times that we're aware of. I think in 2018 and 2019, and both times he was talked out of it. He was said, no, NATO's the be all end all of U.S. national security. We need to stay in NATO.
Why?
But there's really no reason. Russia has no designs against NATO countries. Putin,
Even
certainly,
if they did, what skin would we lose if they took them? I mean, what do we
Well-
get out of Europe today? I mean, Europe is not providing anything that we actually really need in this country. I mean, yeah, it's a homeland for a lot of people, and there's an emotional connection. But it may be because I'm from the South. My ancestors are so far removed, we don't even remember Europe, except for when we got sent over in war to defend it in World War I. My granddad, World War II, my dad. That's
Yeah.
all they knew about Europe. They get sent over there to defend it. What are we doing over here?
well, I would argue that the U.S. does have a vital national interest in ensuring the freedom and independence of Western Europe as well as Japan. Being strong industrial powers with some military potential and that are aligned with the U.S. But with regards to Eastern Europe, and particularly the Baltics and other former Soviet republics, the U.S. has no national interest at all in defending those countries. I've been very skeptical since the Baltics were added in 2004 to NATO, whether the U.S. should remain in NATO. And I guess my solution that I've come up with is that the U.S. should reform NATO into a two-tier system in which the first tier would be Western Europe. The U.S. would retain its NATO commitment to defend those countries under Article 5. But then Eastern Europe, the U.S. should renounce its obligation to defend Eastern European countries as kind of a requirement in order for it to remain a NATO member, and that would go far to ensure U.S. national security, because Eastern Europe, as we've learned from 2 world wars, is a tinderbox. It's regional alliances, its great power alliances have caused 2 regional wars to erupt into world wars in Eastern Europe. The first one, of course, being in Serbia, with the Archduke Ferdinand crisis in June and July of 1914, which led to World War I, the loss of maybe 40 million lives, and then World War II, which cost nearly double that amount of lives with the Danzig crisis in Poland. So those were both, essentially border disputes. This is a third border dispute in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and it's threatening to erupt into World War III. Why? Because of the great power alliance we have in NATO. If the U.S. were not a NATO member, does anyone really believe we would care about Ukraine? No, of course we wouldn't. Ukraine only matters to the U.S. Deep state elites because it borders on NATO countries. But as I said, Putin has no ambitions, no territorial ambitions outside of the former Soviet Union, and very limited, even relatively limited in Ukraine, totaling at most 20% of its internationally recognized territory. And it was much less than that. It was more like 6.4% of Ukraine's pre-war territory until September, when Putin proceeded to annex 4 Ukrainian oblasts, as they predicted he would back in April, in the event that Zelensky refused to hammer out a peace deal with Moscow.
So he did what he said he would do in that regard. Now, the whole war is a very tragic thing. I hate war, I abhor war. And but it's already launched. A lot of the cat's out of the bag. A lot of water is under the bridge. The things that we could have, should have, is no longer something we can get back to. So we got a hand that's played to us, and we got an administration that's determined to take it whichever way they're going to take it, and that seems to be pretty apparent. So what can we do at this point to diffuse this situation?
Well, let me first go back to the last question. The discussion we were having, and that is, I wanted to say that I've come to believe that our biggest mistake of the post-Cold War era, in which we lost our Cold War victory over the Soviet Union, is that we failed to include Russia in the security architecture of Europe. The easiest way we could have done that is we could have invited Russia and Ukraine to join NATO simultaneously.
Yeah.
If we had done that if we'd done that by 1995, Russia and China would never become allies, let alone strategic partners. The Sino-Russian strategic partnership agreements were not signed until '96. They didn't become formal allies until 2001. So if we had invited Russia to join NATO in 1995, Putin may have never come to power, and if he had, he would have pursued his initial kind of pro-Western. He was considered very pro-European, wanting to integrate Russia with the EU. So that of course is kind of a lost dream. When I first came out with that idea most recently earlier this year, I think there's maybe you can count on one hand, which of the 30 NATO countries would support that in the event the war in Ukraine was ended. But in terms of what Putin really wants, I mean, he told us exactly what he wanted with his draft, mutual security agreement. And that's something he came up with back in 2007, by the way. But this was the latest version of it. And essentially what it says is, he doesn't care about the NATO. He doesn't want to roll back NATO. A lot of people have said, hey, Putin has demanded, we roll back NATO to its, Cold War boundaries, in which essentially kicking out Eastern Europe and the Baltics. And that's just simply not the case. What he said is he wanted all US and Western NATO troops to withdraw from Eastern Europe, and all NATO infrastructure to be withdrawn as well. So all bases, any NATO bases with US troops and Western NATO troops would be closed, and the troops withdrawn. And back at the start of the war, we had I think we had 5,000 US troops total in all of Eastern Europe, and other Western NATO countries had 4,000. So if we could even go back to the pre-war status quo of only 9,000 Western NATO troops in Eastern Europe, that would be a huge improvement. And if we could go even farther and go back to the pre-2016 NATO status quo, in which no Western NATO troops were in Eastern Europe, that's a really an interesting thing. A lot of people don't realize is that for 17 years, there were no US troops and no Western NATO troops in any Eastern European countries, and Russia didn't bother them. Russia didn't, there was no aggression. A lot of people say today, well, we have 50,000 US troops in Eastern Europe, and if they were to leave, then Russia would just roll in. And that's just, it's not supported by the facts that we know of about Putin's his ambitions in Europe, which are
ambitions have
very limited.
Could his ambitions have changed? Maybe he wouldn't have then, but after the war and what's gone down, maybe he would today.
Well, I think the key point for your listeners is that NATO has essentially been the cause of the Russian threat. Russia certainly, so there's two elements of threat. There's intent and capabilities. So Russia has always had the capability to destroy the US and NATO, stemming from, I guess, the 60s. They obtained that capabilities while the Soviet Union existed in the 60s, or perhaps the late 50s. But in terms of intent, they have not had the intent to do so, and would only do so in the event they were provoked. Putin has had ample opportunity. He has cyber, EMP, and nuclear weapons, which could erase all of NATO countries, Ukraine and the US, off the map of the world, and he's chosen not to use them. So he's even knowing that the US is directing and coordinating attacks, destroying targets within Russia itself, and that's not including the territories they annexed in Ukraine. Putin has done very little in response. Now, there's I'm sure your listeners are aware of the 2-hour breakdown of the FAA computer network, which they had to ground all US flights. That was likely a cyber attack, either from Russia or China. So they have incredible capabilities. They could shut us down within hours, if not minutes. And they've chosen not to do so yet. But unfortunately, all of these provocations over time, if extended and increased, make a massive cyber attack that could, kill millions of Americans much more likely. And that's, that as a EMP, the Task Force on National Homeland Security that you and I help lead, our purpose is to defend, ensure that Americans are defended and protected against not just EMP threats, but also nuclear and cyber threats as well. And part of what we can do as an organization to defend the U.S. is to promote a more realist foreign policy that's less provocative. Because, as I said, there's intent and there's capability. Russia and China will always have the capability to destroy us, North Korea as well. But if we can come to accommodations with them, and I wouldn't call it appeasement, because we're going to defend our treaty allies, at least in terms of the strategy that I've been promoting, but we shouldn't be intervening and interfering in their spheres of influence. And that would include Ukraine, the former Soviet Union outside of the Baltic states, and Taiwan and the South China Sea. So we have to come to some kind of understanding with the Moscow and Beijing that we will keep our military forces and arms outside of their spheres of influence, just as we have, we claim a sphere of influence over two different continents, not just North and South America, and Russia and China as nuclear superpowers with, I would argue, more nuclear weapons than we have today that they have deployed. Either one of them have more at this point. Russia has several times more. If we don't, if we stop essentially poking the Russian bear in the eye, if we don't do that, then we risk the destruction of the country, the great country we love.
That's what worries me. Some people think Russia's not going to respond. They've committed. I've got friends who say Russia's committed such crime that we need to go right in there and hold them accountable, put them on trial for war crimes. And I think that would be the existential threat level that absolutely would make them respond. And then they come back and says, well, no, Russia can't even launch anything, but yet they're launching stuff. So I find some of the viewpoints out there, let's say highly interesting.
Yeah.
To be charitable. What do you think the actual risk of a nuclear war is? Where do you think the real red lines are? What would really prompt Putin to launch a nuclear war, and how close are we? Tactical, strategic? Look at each one of those, and how close do you think we are to that?
Well, let me start with, Rebecca Koffler, of course, a former DIA Russia analyst, has stated that the current risk of Russian nuclear escalation is around 30%. I think that's accurate. That would include either EMP or tactical nukes employed against Ukraine to force their conditional surrender. So I think that's absolutely on the table. The more that we do to help Ukraine win battlefield, battles, the greater the chance that we provoke Putin to win the war in days or less than a week with using nuclear, cyber, or EMP weapons.
Well, let me put that in perspective so people understand what 30% means. That is like playing Russian roulette with a 6-shooter revolver when you add 2 bullets in. You add 2 in the chamber, you spin it, and you put it to your head. Is this the kind of thing that we want to be doing, taking a 30% risk? You've got to ask yourself, is to our homeland here, is it worth us taking that kind of risk? That's a discussion that's not been held at the national level, and I'm not going to presuppose the answer. I've got my opinions about that, but this discussion has not been held. People are just automatically making those decisions for us, and without due course of conversation, in my humble opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, people still realize, President Biden himself has admitted that we're closer to a nuclear apocalypse than at any time we've ever been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's 61, at the time it was 60 years. During most of the Cold War, we were not this close to nuclear war. Now, I will say that I don't believe that Russian nuclear use or EMP use, super EMP weapon use in Ukraine, I don't think that would lead to a nuclear war with Russia. I think that would most likely, I think Biden would not respond militarily. So I think that would actually encourage him and cause him to pressure Ukraine, say, hey, this has gone nuclear. We need to support a ceasefire. I'll help you get the best peace deal we can get. But short of moving more troops to Eastern Europe, I don't think Biden would do anything militarily, to be honest. I mean, certainly there's a chance that there's a lot of crazy people like General Petraeus and other retired four-star generals in the deep state that are calling on, the U.S. to annihilate, stage a massive conventional bombing campaign and strikes against targets inside the Russian Federation that include, Crimea and the 4 Ukrainian oblasts. But we've never, people don't realize in our history, we've never directly fought another nuclear power. And there's a very good reason for that, because you fight another country, let alone a country like Russia with over 4 times more nukes than we have. But you fight another nuclear power and the chances of nuclear escalation are very high. I mean, they're almost, certainly at least cyber and EMP, they're inevitable. I would say that if we fight China over Taiwan directly, if we fight Russia over Ukraine directly, minimally we'll have a massive, Russian Chinese cyber attack that will take out the U.S. and shut down our power, our internet, all our entire financial system, our economy, critical infrastructure, all of our satellites, GPS, early warnings, food and water distribution, water purification systems. It's the same. It's a very similar scenario to EMP. And my hope is, if it comes to that, which would be disastrous, the difference between, I tell people when I give briefings here in Utah and with video interviews, the main difference between cyber and EMP is that EMP is almost permanent. It's almost the permanent destruction of our critical infrastructure, whereas cyber can be temporary. It can be turned on and off. And in an ideal scenario, if there is a massive cyber attack that shuts us down, if Russia and China would give their blackmail peace terms, like essentially a ransom, and say, we don't want any of your money, but these are the terms you'll have to adhere to in order for us to restore your systems and lift our cyber attacks. And those terms, of course, would be the U.S. would have to pull out of the Russian and Chinese spheres of influence minimally and never send any weapons again. But that's what we should do. That's what we should do in our national security interests. And if we did that, the threat of Russian and Chinese cyber, EMP, and nuclear attack would go, from the greatest we've had essentially in that last 60 years to a much lower and more reasonable level that would go far to enhance and ensure U.S. national security.
Did you hear about the hacking group Cold River, which did a phishing attacks on Brookhaven, Oregon, and the National Livermore laboratories? And these are a lot of our key national nuclear laboratories, and apparently the Russians were already trying to hack those this past year. So you could say this has already begun to some level. Now that's not the shut everything down level, but it is out there. So
yeah, absolutely. So either the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the day after, Russian cyber attacks against the U.S. escalated 8 times by 800%.
Wow.
And currently, it's about 1 million Russian cyber attacks a day on the U.S. So obviously, those are low-level attacks. A lot of them are probing and stealing information. But really, I mean, tests of their capabilities in terms of, shutting down, our fuel pipelines in 14 states has occurred, last year, the year before, and then, likely with this 2-hour shutdown of our flight system as well. They can do so much more, and they will do it if we continue along this path of escalation against Russia and China. Reagan pursued a policy of peace through strength. Biden, I feel, is pursuing a policy of war through weakness. We were, we at least had rough military nuclear parity with the Soviet Union, and they respected us because we were strong. Today, the U.S. under Biden is much weaker relatively to Russia and China. And unlike the Cold War, Russia and China are close military allies. So that really changes the equation. In a superpower, or nuclear or great power scenario, you always want to be the side that's superior, that has the most population, the most military potential, the greatest economic potential, industrial power. And in this case, we're overmatched in all 4 of those areas. We have, much less population in terms of Western countries versus the Sino-Russian alliance. China has 120% larger economy than we do. They have twice our manufacturing industrial capabilities. And then technologically, they're on par overall, but in key weapon systems, they are more advanced than we are. And that's something we never had during the Cold War. I mean, the Soviets they were more advanced in a few systems, but then, but overall, we had the nuclear forces to balance that out. We had 7,200 nuclear weapons in Europe alone. Today, we have no more than 200. So we've disarmed unilaterally of 94% of our nuclear arsenal, and meanwhile, Russia and China have been massively rebuilding theirs.
Yeah.
China's has never been larger, and they're on track to build up to 4,500 nuclear weapons, which is much larger than what we have deployed today with our 1,715 nuclear weapons.
Yeah, hey, just for a quick shameless plug, that's why people need to prepare. You go to prepwithgreg.com, you find $100 off the special right now of 1 month supply of food. Lasts 25 years, 2,000 calories a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the new deputy director for the MP task force, John Hollerman, will tell you that that's a lot better than the other competitors when you get 2,000 calories a day, because most only give you 800. So check it out, prepwithgreg.com. Yeah, you really need to get ready for this stuff, guys. Now, I'll get off that real fast and back to the topic here. What we have really a composite risk between Russia and China. Yeah, and it's when you bring China in that we're at the graver risk, because America has won every war it's won is a war of attrition. We do have more industrial power than Russia. They have more nukes than us presently, but we do have more industrial power, manpower, and a bigger economy than Russia. But when you pull China into the equation, it don't look so pretty at all. There's no way at the present we would win with China as a war of attrition unless we could blockade them and cut them off from all their resources. I mean, but Russia gives China kind of a get out of jail free card to some degree in that area, because they're building pipelines and other avenues of getting resources into China. So that alliance puts America at peril. And I had back in the past, I mean, like 3 years ago at least, done videos on my channel where I said, hey, we should make peace with Russia and get an alliance with them against China, because I saw the real threat in China. And I know that in the long term, even if Russia and China took the United States out, they're going to turn on each other and China will win. And Russians know that. So Russians have to be somewhere in their deep, darkest reserves more concerned with China than us. And I think we really blew it by not doing that. Now, this is water in the bridge. I don't know how we can repair things today with all the broken eggs that are out there. And I've got a lot of good friends who are absolutely 100% pro-Russian. I got friends that are absolutely 100% pro-China, Ukraine and the conflict over there. I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm just trying to look at the threat that we face as Americans. So with that said, when you look, now you said it was 30% probability of war, nuclear war, and that's talking about Russia. When you pull China into this and you look at the composite risk of what's going on and Ukraine, Taiwan, the potential for China to invade Taiwan. What do you think the composite risk for nuclear war is that the United States face? This is just based on your assessment. What do you see as the composite risk over the next 10 years?
That's a really difficult question, and the ultimate answer, I think no one but Biden knows, because we know Biden is a controlled asset of the Chinese Communist Party. He's received, his family's received 31 million that we know from China. We just had revelations that he was paid $1 million for his role as I don't know, chairman of the Pyne Biden Center, in which he was. It was recently revealed that he had a significant number of top secret SCI, secret compartmentalized information, intelligence papers that were unguarded, in an unsecure environment. And that's an impeachable offense, I would argue, in and of itself. But the fact
where China had, Trump has said that China had access to that. Is that true?
We don't know if China had access to it. However, I think it's likely they did. There's been at least 55 million paid by China, by anonymous Chinese donors, likely, government affiliated Chinese Communist Party members, paid to finance the Biden Center. And of course, 1 million of that we know went to Biden's personal bank account. So far that we know of, there's likely 1 million from that in Chinese communist money. Then there's also, he's received another at least 3 million, 3.1 million, the 10% is the big guy, essentially, that into his private bank account. And it was revealed last year that Biden, there was a $5.2 million discrepancy in Biden's tax records between the income that he can account for and what he can't account for. So clearly, there's a bunch of criminally flagged bank transactions that have occurred that hopefully the House GOP majority will investigate. Chairman Comer and the Oversight Committee and others, Jim Jordan at Judiciary. And we just need to find out to what extent is we know that Biden is a controlled asset, but to what extent is he controlled? Is he controlled to the extent that in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, he'll kind of that he is he gonna oppose that in any way, or is he simply going to do economic sanctions? Now, from my standpoint, I think an economic war against China would be the best response to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. If in fact the U.S. sends, our naval and air forces, if we declare war against China, obviously our forces in theater will get mostly wiped out in preemptive strikes against our military bases, especially in Okinawa and Guam, and also the North Marianas. But are we going to, send additional forces to try to break the Chinese blockade of Taiwan? Because if we do that, they're going to respond with, what's cyber strikes, a massive cyber attack against the U.S., possibly nuclear strikes against U.S. military bases and our allies. So, the point I want to drive home once again is it's how the U.S. its U.S. actions and U.S. responses to Russian and Chinese military actions that is putting at risk our allies, because the quickest way to destroy our treaty allies is to get involved in a war with China over Taiwan, because they'll be the first ones to go. Japan's would likely get nuked, South Korea as well, perhaps Australia. And the easiest way to secure them is to come to an agreement, like I propose, some kind of reunification agreement with China and Taiwan, in which the rights of the Taiwanese, would be protected. Now, of course, we know that that the likelihood of China honoring such an agreement is modest at best. But if we could secure limited guarantees, perhaps have the the nationalist, old nationalist Chinese party, the Kuomintang, which Chiang Kai-shek led, that when it relocated Taiwan, they're currently the opposition party. But if we were to say that they would be in charge of Taiwan essentially under Chinese supervision, things like that, ensuring immigration, amnesty for opponents, allowing anyone to leave Taiwan, and then some limited political and religious rights. But essentially, there's nothing we can do. As President Trump recognized in John Bolton's book, most recent book, he quoted Trump as saying, Taiwan is 80 miles from, or actually he said 100 miles from China, and like 8,000 miles from the US. It's actually 81 miles from China and about 6,900 miles from the US, but who's counting? But essentially what he said, because of that, there's literally nothing we could do to defend Taiwan. It's an unwinnable war, even more so than Ukraine. It's an unwinnable war for the US. If we get involved, we lose. There was a recent war game that I participated, or I joined the webinar that discussed the war game, and essentially what they said is, if we use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons against China, we lose. If they use them against us first, we lose. It's in a nuclear conflict with China, we're going to lose. And the reasons for that are they have overwhelming theater nuclear superiority in the region. They have the largest nuclear ballistic missile force in the world, nuclear capable. They would have, according to one of our top naval experts at the Center for Security Policy, they would have a 10-to-1 advantage over us in warships in any naval fight. So it's just really, it's not a balanced fight. And, in accordance with what I call the Reagan-Weinberger-Powell doctrine, is you never fight wars that you can't win. You have to have a set of an achievable aim, an objective. And if you don't commit U.S. forces to a war you can't win, like Vietnam, of course, being the quintessential no-win war. Now, I believe we could have won Vietnam. We could have, if we had the political willpower, we could have invaded and occupied North Vietnam, and we could have won that way, just in that sense. But the way we fought it was a no-win war, and it should never have been fought because we were too constrained. But we didn't have we had the advantage of fighting the Cold War, the wars in Korea and Vietnam, with US nuclear superiority. Today, we live in a world with Russian and Chinese nuclear superiority. So that is a world in which, we're not going to win major wars, direct wars against Russia and China.
Well, there has been some recent simulation that claims, most of them have said that, but one recent one has said that China couldn't win trying to take and invade Taiwan. Of course, that presupposed our involvement, but it would come at heavy cost to all parties involved. I don't know. That's the thing about war is you never know which way it's going to go. You can have the best plans, but no good plan survives first contact with the enemy, and it just gets messy. Wars are messy by definition, so it's not a pretty situation. Now, all that said, I just want to, in defense of Taiwan for a little bit, look at it from the other side. We might have a special conversation just on China, so we probably want to cut this short. But if Taiwan falls, I think South Korea and Japan are going to be in a real tough situation. Even if it don't fall, if China takes over a major chunk of the first island chain, that with what they got in the South China Sea, they could own that area and deny access and trade routes to South Korea and Japan, and that would put them in a severe disadvantage to the point that they might declare war on China on their own because they're going to be in peril over that. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think that, I've always said that China's master plan is not to wage war, direct war against the US and its allies. It's to take us over economically. So, that's really their preference. President Xi's preference is to achieve Chinese global hegemony, not by troops, not by, I mean, certainly he is expanding China's military bases across the world, but he would prefer not to have to occupy the U.S. or occupy our U.S. allies or risk nuclear war with us. He would prefer rather to simply buy up our country. He's already, bought up our politicians. China owns 75 to 80% of U.S. Our farmland and food production facilities here in Utah. So, it's been a slow process. They've been buying, all kinds of strategic.
How much in Utah?
Over 75% of Utah food production is owned by China.
Are you serious? 75%?
Yeah.
That is, how do we permit that? I mean, I personally don't think it's desirable to have a nation who don't care for freedom come in this country and acquire such a swath of our resources. I really am not for being conquered economically.
Yeah. So, what I'm trying to say is I don't, there's a lot of the first and second island chain arguments. I don't agree with them. I don't think that our allies would be more at risk if China were to reunify with Taiwan through Chinese aggression. I think we draw a line in the sand around our treaty allies in the Pacific. That would be Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. And we say, this far and no farther, essentially. So, that would expose, small island nations in the Pacific to potential Chinese invasion, occupation. But we would not, we would make it clear that we will defend militarily our four treaty allies in the Pacific. And I think China would respect that. I really do. I really do. I don't think that they would cross that line because it would be a line that would not cross into their own sphere of influence. So I think we need to do that with Russia as well and say, NATO is the line, and we're not going to aid Ukraine anymore. We're going to cut off military aid to Ukraine. And that would force Zelensky very quickly to accept Russia's ceasefire offer that would essentially keep the line of control along the same line that it is right now. And, that's a travesty, of course. I mean, if I had my personal way, I would eject the Russian troops out of the Donbass. I'd let them keep Crimea because Crimea is 75% Russian ethnically. But that's just not the world we live in. I mean, Henry Kissinger and Nixon and other realists, realize that there are limits to U.S. military power, and that's never been more true today. And we can live in a world defined by America's Cold War victory, and we can keep NATO's boundaries where they're at, into the Soviet space in the Baltics, but we just can't keep expanding. Ukraine has always been the red line for Russia. Ukraine is the #1 vital interest for Putin, for Russia, and we've crossed it, and that's why Russia invaded. If we had accepted Putin's proposal to make Ukraine return it to neutral buffer state status as it was under President Yanukovych, then that would have prevented the invasion, the Russian invasion of eastern and southern Ukraine. So we need to get back to a clear-eyed foreign policy realist strategy that won us the Cold War, and reestablish these nuclear these safeguards we had, which JFK has wisely established, which prevented a nuclear war in the 1960s over Cuba, in which he gave. Actually, a lot of people don't realize that JFK gave more to the Soviets than he got back from the Soviets. He repudiated the West, the Monroe Doctrine, and said, we'll let Cuba remain communist indefinitely. We'll never invade them. He said, well, we'll draw all of our medium-range ballistic nuclear missiles from Italy and from Turkey in exchange for, the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. And that saved the lives of, he estimated, 100 million Americans. And I think that might be true. And we have the chance right now to implement an America First national security strategy that I've been advocating that could save 250 million American lives, and an equal number of European and Asian lives, if not many more than that. So we really need to fundamentally rethink our foreign policy and national security strategy. We need to abandon our strategy of liberal hegemony that the deep state and the globalists have been advocating and pursuing over the past 30 years, that have got us into these huge national security messes, that any one of which with North Korea, China, or Russia could result in the destruction of our great country. And that's something we need to avoid. We need to abandon the hubris we have. I mean, Republican congressmen, they talk about escalating the war on Russia and fighting China over Taiwan, and they're completely devoid of any, they're not grounded in reality. And that's a very dangerous thing. When the other side, when their leaders are more rational actors than our own, that can get us into a third world war that we can't win.
Okay, I buy that. So let me ask you this: given the current administration that's going to be in power for 2 more years, they've got the Senate, the Congress is, who knows where they're going to go in terms of the House, as you just mentioned. This war will probably be over in 2 years. So what realistically, given the cards we're dealt, who's in power, what realistically can we do at this point? What should the citizens here do? Who should they call? Who should they ring their bells to take some kind of action? And what should that action be? What can we do?
Well, I think we have a shot. We have a fighting chance with the Republicans returning to control the House of Representatives. The deep state obviously is firmly in control of the Senate on both sides, with McConnell and Schumer. But in the House, McCarthy is, he's not a deep stater, but he's not, an America First conservative either. He's kind of in between. But he's open, obviously, as his 15 votes for speakership demonstrated, the America First conservatives that oppose war with Russia over Ukraine and oppose continued military aid to Ukraine, they have a substantial say, and they can do a motion to vacate at any time. And if the Democrats join with them, McCarthy's gone. He's toast. So, they have a real say and a chance to influence, national security policy. So I think what we do is, President Trump has stated it's vitally important that we pursue a ceasefire with Russia in Ukraine. And, he and other America First conservatives have talked about the need for the U.S. and Russia to negotiate directly, ideally without even Ukrainian participation, because what Biden has essentially done is he has subcontracted U.S. national security policy regarding Russia to Zelensky, and Zelensky's a hothead. He is not someone we want to make the decision to whether to get us into World War III with Russia, because he's already made clear that's his goal. He's made clear since April his ultimate goal is to embroil the U.S. and NATO in a war with Russia, which he naively thinks won't turn nuclear, won't escalate to the EMP level, because he knows that's his only potential hope for regaining control of Crimea and the Donbass region. What he doesn't realize is that that would threaten. That is the only thing that will threaten Ukraine's existence, is continuation of the war. Essentially, Russia's on the verge of a massive winter counteroffensive or offensive, which Ukraine is predicting will likely occur in early February. And Putin has permanently expanded the size of the Russian army by 500,000 troops, so active duty troops. So we started the war with 280,000 Russian army active duty troops. Now he's going to have maybe 780,000. So that's a huge expansion. And already, Russia has doubled the number of troops in Ukraine. So it no longer is has a disadvantage. You know, it's been fighting the war for most of the all of last year with a numerical disadvantage to Ukrainian troops. Ukrainian forces have enjoyed a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 numerical advantage over Russian troops in Ukraine. So that's going to change. Russia is likely to achieve parity or superiority. And with that, with those numerical increases, they're going to be able to retake probably you know, all of the territory that they lost, certainly since September with the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
I would submit that time is not on Ukraine's side. I have seen this war a lot like the American war between the states, in which the South was winning for 2 years, and I mean winning fabulously, but the South could not hold up over the long term, the long game, because we didn't have the manpower and materials, we didn't have the manufacturing, and we got out treated by the northern states. You know, they just kept bringing more men, and at the end of the war, the Confederate Army was staffed by old men and boys, and it was a very ugly situation. And I see Ukraine Ukraine, when they lose a fighter, they don't replace it so easily. You know, the Russian fighters may not, you know, be the best, you know, there are out there in the field, but they can just keep throwing so many of them in this, and their factories can keep churning. They've lost a lot of stuff, but in the long term, time is not on Ukraine's side. If Ukraine wants a victory, they got to move really fast and make it happen within the next, I'd say, half a year. I'm skeptical that they could actually accomplish that. So I think the negotiated treaty is the best way, and something needs to be done to put a stop to the carnage. And it will, I think both sides would benefit, because I think the long term in this is going to be ugly. I know a lot of people think that, you know, that Ukrainians should take back every ounce and Crimea to boot, but I have a hard time seeing them taking Crimea without a real escalation. If Putin lets them take Crimea without escalating the nuclear, then I'd be surprised. But maybe he will, but I certainly don't see him rolling into Moscow. You know, that's what, you know, Zelensky said he wants to try for war crimes. To do that, he's got to roll into Moscow. That's an existential threat. That's definitely, I don't see how that's not a red line for nuclear war. I just can't see how that's not a red line for nuclear war. Now, maybe he feels like he needs to be vindicated because of what the Russian troops have done in Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, of course, you know, the people in Donetsk, they want some vindication too, I suppose. So wars are ugly. It's a feud. And both sides get hurt. There's nothing pretty. A lot of people who listen to this broadcast have heard from one side or the other, and a lot of them are taking sides. I'm trying not to do that here. I'm trying to take our side as Americans and say, why are we in this? What can we do? We need to cut our losses. And
that's right. That's
negotiated
exactly right.
peace treaty, I think, is a route to cut our losses. And I think in the end, it'll cut the bloodshed in both Europe and Russia.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And that's what I've said all the time, the whole time. I don't take Russia's side. I'm not pro-Russian anyway. I don't take Ukraine. I've been, you know, a little bit more partial to Ukraine, sympathetic wise, but really, I support America. I mean, and a lot of people fail to realize is they conflate Ukraine's interests, or America's interests, with Ukraine's, and they're completely polar opposite. You know, as I said, Zelensky is doing everything he can to get Russia and the U.S. and Russia into a full-scale world war, and that's that's literally the polar opposite of our national security interests, which is to avoid a direct war with Russia and China that we would likely lose, and that could cost the lives of 250 million Americans. But yeah, I always have to chuckle whenever I hear that Ukraine's winning the war, that Russia's on the ropes, and Putin's about to be removed. I mean, let's be realistic here. The Russian Federation is at least 29 times larger than Nazi Germany at its greatest extent, and Ukraine has failed to occupy any Russian territory, of at least pre-war Russian territory, and Russia still controls nearly 20% of Ukraine. So is Ukraine really winning if they control 0% of Russia and Russia controls 20% of Ukraine? Obviously, the narrative is wrong. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has stated, Ukraine's essentially hit its high watermark, and that's absolutely true, borne out by the facts that back in October, November, that's as much territory as they're ever going to be able to take. And the time to negotiate was then, and it's now, because from here on out, Ukraine is going to lose, and we won't be able to, the deep state media, regime media, is not going to be able to cover that up. As Russia will retake, town after town, city after city, perhaps even region after region over the coming year, and up to the point where the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine is predicting that Putin's going to take a second shot at taking Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, and that's definitely a possibility. But even if they were to simply surround Ukrainian forces, army troops in southeastern Ukraine, I've talked about how they could do a pincer maneuver, go up from Kherson along the eastern bank of the Dnieper River in Ukrainian, and then from Sumy or that direction in a southwestern direction, they could potentially surround 50-60,000 Ukrainian troops, and then Ukraine they would have lost most of their best troops, and that would expose the rest of Ukraine to potential Russian occupation. So it's just a matter of time. As you alluded to, the Russian economy is currently about 15 times larger than Ukraine. They have 4 times the population. They have 4 to 5 times as many troops available, not in Ukraine, but in terms of active reserve forces that can be fully mobilized within a matter of 3 months, 90 days. And of course, they have 8,000 more nuclear weapons. Ukraine has none. And in the very fact the US, there's not a single country in the world that has sent combat troops officially to fight Russia and Ukraine. It's the battle, the war of attrition, as you mentioned, it's very much against Ukraine. Yes, Poland has sent thousands of troops, volunteers to fight as unofficial, volunteers. The Polish Legion, we found out recently that they lost 1,200 dead Polish troops. But we also heard from the EU president that the European Union president has stated that Ukraine has lost 100,000 dead troops, and that's likely 3 to 4 times as many as Russia has lost. So we're not hearing the full truth. The problem with having a republic and being able to keep a constitutional republic is you have to have an informed electorate. You have to have a moral electorate. I don't think we have a moral electorate. We definitely don't have an informed electorate. We have a misinformed electorate, and despite the fact that Biden is always complaining about misinformation, disinformation, they and the Biden administration and the Biden regime media are the prime purveyors of disinformation. I would argue perhaps even more so than Russia itself. We hear 80% of what we hear about the war in Ukraine is largely disinformation. It's a very slanted viewpoint, doesn't reflect what's actually happening in the war.
That's why I try to warn people on my channel. They come up with all this, and now I'm getting hit on both sides of stuff. And I say, look, it's all propaganda. You get tons of propaganda come from both sides of this equation. So, a lot of that is just bunk. But anyway, all righty. Wars are messy. They're ugly. We just need to end this if we can.
Exactly.
All right, David. Hey, I appreciate you very much. I appreciate you for what you do for our national security. And we'll do this again, and we might pick up China next time. Maybe it won't be too long because there's a lot to cover in these areas, and we've not talked in a while. I think you got picked up and made a superstar on the Canadian prepper side after appearing over here.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it was you I have to thank for that connection. So I really appreciate that. I've had 2 interviews with Nate on Canadian prepper.
Yeah, he's got a big channel, get a lot of attention there, so that's good. Yep. Anyway, and I hope he's doing well. So if he's watching, hey, Nate. All right, David, take care. And
all right, you too. Take care. Thanks a lot. Thanks for all you do.
And thank you, everyone. And with that, I'm going to say, check out the other videos, and Greg out.